it's difficult to place the band number 2 distinctly into the genre because the music that kicked them off into superstardom, was considered that, second wave of British metal, right? And that's Def Leppard. I mean, they had their time away, right? So if they had recorded right after Pyromania, right, the only record stopping them, Thriller, they were massively huge at that point. And then Rick Allen has that accident and loses his arm. So now your entire career is in doubt, unless you just want to drop the guy. Which, let's be honest, a lot of bands probably would have. How do you have a one-armed drummer? Nevertheless, they regroup and they come back and longer than a record cycle, right? So normally a band will record a record. So we'll use Poison as an example. 1986, they go ahead, look at the Cat Dragged In. They then tour. They do the tour. Tour's like a year, get in the studio. I think it's 88 is the next record, right? And that's kind of like the cycle. Release a record, tour, record, release a record, tour. So usually like 2-year cycles. But for Def Leppard, it was, 82? I think it's 82. So let's see. Trying to look at the timeline for them as far as when they came back after Pyromania, because the guy had to learn how to go ahead and drum all over the place with his feet, which is a completely different way to go ahead. And no, I mean, obviously drummers are using their feet. Okay. So Pyromania came out in 1983, was huge. And then Hysteria came out in 87. So really, it might seem like that's not that big a gap, but in the minds of music fans, I mean, that's a fair amount of time in between, because they started recording in 84. And because of everything that happened, took them till 87 before they could go ahead and get a release. And when the first song came out, I think it was Animal, it was like a tepid response. Really wasn't that big a deal. Same thing with Women. I mean, they didn't come right out hitting the gate. Now, part of it was the sound was a little bit different, because obviously it had to be. The songs were structured differently because of Rick Allen. Nevertheless, Hysteria, huge album, but are they a glam band? I guess you can even say the same thing about, Whitesnake too. So Whitesnake, Bon Jovi, Def Leppard. Are they, I don't want to say transcending hair metal. I just think maybe they're not actually hair metal. They're just rock bands. And they didn't even necessarily completely live up to the imagery. Now, certainly they updated the look to be more appropriate and blend in with all that. But even on Hysteria, other than some long hair and Joe's crazy mullet, it was basically just, jeans, torn jeans. And that's really about it. You juxtapose that with Poison and all the spandex and the teased hair and the makeup, couldn't be more different. So, number 1. I think all of you probably have guessed what it is. But I am going to wait before I tell you what number 1 is. So I told you earlier that I didn't know why Europe made the list. So for me, I think Stryper should be on the list before Europe. I understand the Final Countdown, blah, blah, blah. Okay, I get it. But you want to talk about the look. You want to talk about the LA scene. You want to talk about being in the LA scene and being Christian and not indulging in the LA scene. That's pretty amazing. And to then be a multi-platinum band, that's also pretty impressive given that they're a Christian band, who, by the way, they had their radio songs, their hook-heavy songs. But then some of their stuff was borderline thrash because these guys were huge like Iron Maiden fans and Judas Priest fans. So the Christian band was actually heavier than most of their counterparts in the glam scene, which I always found really interesting. But I think Stryper not being on the list of top 10 glam, hair, whatever you want to call it, I think it's a travesty. I think it's ridiculous. I could think of like 3 other bands that I would have on the list before Europe. And like I said, I probably would have popped out, Leppard and Bon Jovi. But based upon the list, that's the most glaring omission for me. So back to number 1. And a surprise to no one, it is the mighty Motley Crue. Vince Neil, Mick Mars, Tommy Lee, Nikki Sixx, the original bad boys of the LA scene. And by the way, have you noticed that Guns N' Roses is not on this list? Interesting, right? Isn't that also a glaring omission? But are they just a rock band? So, Motley Crue, kind of hard to go ahead and deny it. As Nikki Sixx once said, I wanted a band that would be like David Bowie and the Sex Pistols thrown in a blender with Black Sabbath. Other than, Vince. Vince having his own very unique delivery and style, which back in the day was pretty damn amazing. And let's see, the last time I saw Motley Crue in concert, it was with Warrant as the opening act. And that was on the Dr. Feelgood tour. And Vince was in fine, full-voiced form. And they were just exceptional. Exceptional. I mean, they really were. This is when Tommy was climbing that ladder up to his drum kit. The one that he got stuck up there one time. But they are the glam band. They are the hair band. And I think it's indisputable. And they have some really good music. And I think they kind of get, from a critical perspective, kind of, poo-pooed as far as songwriting. But I think Nikki Sixx is a really great writer. And I think Mick Mars is probably the most underrated guitar player. Because they're just not looked at as being musicians. I mean, come on. Tommy Lee's a really freaking good drummer. Mick Mars is a really, really freaking good guitar player. Nicky's a good solid bass player, but he's also this tremendous songwriter. And there's Vince. No offense, Vince. But I think it's a decent list. But I mean, again, if you're not going to have Guns N' Roses, then you shouldn't have Def Leppard and you shouldn't have Bon Jovi. But I must say that I'm really, really interested in, and so is actually my oldest son. He is 16. He'll be 17 this summer. And he would really like to see that Motley Crue, Def Leppard, Poison, Joan Jett tour. So I'm saying that, maybe Def Leppard shouldn't be on the list, but, they're touring with Motley Crue. Yet a few years ago, Def Leppard was touring with Journey. And one year they were touring with Foreigner, which to me makes more sense in many ways. But if you're looking at that tour as being not a hairband tour, but a 80s rock nostalgia tour, I mean, how do you go wrong with Motley Crue, Def Leppard, Poison, and Joan Jett? I mean, that's just exceptional. And I'm really trying to balance, like, okay, do we spend the ridiculous amount of some money now on the secondary market to go and see them? And understanding that at least 2 of the singers on there are not going to be particularly good. Vince forgets words, and he has the tone is good. He can still hit notes. He just doesn't know the words. And Joe Elliott has been consistently plagued with vocal issues. And if you go back, and there was a documentary that was made, not a documentary, a rockumentary. It was like the fictionalized biographical account, and the actors were playing, all the guys in the band, and how he learned to sing in that higher register, and it really is pushing himself. So he does consistently have throat issues. I don't know. Still think it'd be a hell of a tour. So I'm just wondering, to all of you listening out here, who are the bands that you think are missing from the list? I think there's probably a few that could be on here. I guess you'd probably have to make a top 20 list. I certainly think that, bands that I didn't necessarily enjoy at the time that I came to love later, bands like Kix. Kix is a really good band. Skid Row. Skid Row should be on here. Winger as just musicians. And then there's those early bands. So if you're going to have like the Rats, etc., what about the Night Rangers? Shouldn't they be on here? Because they were a precursor to a lot of this stuff as well. And doesn't Quiet Riot deserve to be on the list? And this is sacrilege for some people, but 1980s no makeup Kiss was very much a glam band. Lick It Up, Crazy Nights, that whole era, Hot in the Shade. I saw them in the Hot in the Shade tour with, did I see Warrant always as opening acts? I think that was with Warrant too. Warrant or Poison. They're a glam band in its purest form because they were coming out of that whole New York scene. New York Dolls, Begets Kiss, etc. Shouldn't they be on the list? So all these things are very, very subjective. So I think what I'd like to do at some point is really have my own top 10 list, or even top 20 list. Just really interesting when I'm looking back at it and how many things happened between really 1980, let's say 1985 and 1989. The Van Halen split, 5150 is 1986. Eat 'Em and Smile is 1986. Poison drops. To Hell with the Devil by Stryper drops in 87. Appetite for Destruction. Hysteria. I mean, it was an exceptional time for guitar-based music. Whether you believe the whole, grunge killed the hair bands, at least the grunge music and that resurgence of punk and that post-punk and that, alternative rock was all guitar-based. So really they were more kin than anything else. The bands like Alice in Chains and Soundgarden, they were bridging the gap, because they could play with, both sets of artists. I think that Monsters of Rock tour, I think Alice in Chains was the opening act, weren't they? But also in 1988, between 1986, 87, 88, you also had thrash, so getting a little bit off the hairband thing, but thrash metal was also happening at the same time. Metallica getting traction, Justice for All, Anthrax at that time, State of Euphoria. I want to say South of Heaven at that time. Was Peace Sells then? I'm trying to remember which record by Megadeth. But nevertheless, guitar-based music, heavy music, that's really what draws me, and it still does. Do I listen to hip-hop? Yes. Do I need to have heavy, distorted guitars necessarily? No. I like jangly pop rock kind of stuff. But these hair bands are such a snapshot into the time. For good or for bad, it was all about excess, but it was also about having fun, right? The grunge bands were not about fun. It was either social commentary or very serious, often dark subjects. That's not to say that the hair bands didn't. Many of them, Motley Crue, for example. Motley Crue definitely went into the dark side of life, but it was still meant to be, at the end of the day, a big party on stage. And I appreciate that. And I think that's what's missing. I think the only ones who are doing like the big party setting is really the rappers. We simply don't have this guitar-based music anymore. And the ones that do exist, some of them have been around this long, because I think people really relate to that. And I think so many of the bands that are on this list have evergreen songs, because I certainly know that my kids listen to some of this stuff and they go, how come this is